Hello and welcome to this segment of The Perspective, where we discuss global issues. The 79th edition of the United Nations General Assembly recently took place. Today, we discuss the outcomes and the resolutions out of this summit, which include climate change mitigation, global inequalities, especially pertaining gender, and global security, including the Ukraine and the Middle East conflicts and the Sudan crisis. As usual, the panel is going to dive deep into this discussion, and I am joined by my panelists, my regular panelist, Abi Agina. Abi Agina, thank you for making time to come and talk to us again.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
You are welcome. Pleasure is all mine, in fact.
All right.
Yeah. I know you have a high affinity of global issues and challenges, and this is one of them. It happens to be that the biggest UN congregation is together, and they are discussing things that affect the world in general. I'm sure at a later stage in this conversation, we shall zero them to the region and see how they affect us. But at the onset, what do you think of what is happening now?
Well, thank you so much, Sam, and always a pleasure to be here with you to discuss global issues and trying to relate them to what it means at a regional level. Well, we did see the UN General Assembly happening in New York, which was a very important event that happens once a year. And this was the highest turnout we've seen in recent history since COVID struck. And we did see quite a number of African presidents take part, including presidents from East Africa who were in attendance, as well as presidents from West and Southern Africa. But really, this UN summit comes on the backdrop of a number of global challenges right now, from issues around the devastation that the climate crisis presents. We are seeing populations are under severe threat to the climate risk across Africa and also at a global level. And the other big conversation definitely that did dominate the discussions in the UN was in regards to the security crisis, where we are seeing the Middle East crisis between Palestine and Gaza has already wiped out quite a number of young children. And the UN actually projects that 5 years from now, it will be a really horrible undertaking in terms of taking the kids back to school. Another issue, of course, without dwelling so much time on it, is the issue around security within Ukraine and Russia and how this has continued to impact on global supply chains. This was also something up for discussion. And more interestingly, Sam, was the Summit of the Future. This is the summit that was discussing artificial intelligence. And this is an area that has shown a lot of interest, Sam, especially right now where Africa is. We are yet to fully tap into the potential that AI offers, especially when it comes to predictive issues touching on various economies, and at the same time, artificial intelligence in solving the climate crisis. And of course, the role artificial intelligence can also play, especially in driving economies here in Africa. And last but not least, of course, was the signing of the pact that allows for multilateralism. And this is a very important pact when you look at the current context of issues that the continent continues to face. And it will be an area that a lot of diplomats will be monitoring very closely, as well as foreign affairs ministers, because we are at a critical juncture in life where there has to be the global call for solidarity, especially among various actors within the regional issues here in East Africa, as well as at an African level. And all this come at a time when we are also gearing up for the COP29. And this will be held this year in Baku, Azerbaijan. And this is a very important summit. We're going into this summit because the bigger conversation that hasn't been fixed is the compensation of countries that have borne the brunt of climate change. Right now, majority of African countries are experiencing the devastating effects that the climate crisis presents, from the drought to the floods, and this has seen countries in Africa experience a lot of shocks in terms of their economies being impacted. We've also seen Africa just receives 3% of the share of financing to climate, and yet Africa is the least of polluters when you look at the global ecosystem. So this is a very important summit, and we do understand that as we go into this summit, there'll be the launch of the Loss and Damage Fund, which has luckily been able to be constituted with a board, and now they have an executive director who will be announced at the summit. And this is an important fund, Sam, because when you look at how African countries are struggling to tackle the climate issues, we are likely to get good funding once this Loss and Damage Fund is established, because the rich countries have not honored their pledges. We are talking about over $100 billion in pledges by developed countries which haven't been met. And this is why there has been this big outcry that we have to see the rich countries walk the talk, so that African countries do not continue to be saddled by this multiple polycrisis.
Well, I want us to break this one by one. For example, regarding climate change, I saw the Executive Secretary, Antonio Guterres, mention that it's important that that there is cooperation, that there are reforms on international cooperation, that there should be, and financial systems. He said that countries should be encouraged to use more green energy, to adopt more. I mean, this is a song that has been on for such a long time. Yeah. Why do you think this time is probably going to be done differently, or what else can be done differently? Because this has been on for such a long time indeed.
And Sam, you've hit the point on the head in terms of this very important issue around the green economy. Right now, the presidents that were attending the United Nations General Assembly, they had their own round table where the various presidents, including Kenya's president, William Ruto, DRC president, we did see Angola president also present there. And they were saying that it is high time that there has to be an overhaul of the global financial framework. Because as it stands right now, Sam, linking it back to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who indicates that there has to be a rethink in terms of how African countries are classified and how they can receive financing. And this connects back to the earlier point that we were discussing around African countries right now are accessing financing, but not at a favorable rate. The interest rates that African countries are accessing capital is astronomically high compared to what we are seeing with the rich countries. So these are some of the reforms that are being actually advocated at the highest level by the UN to be able to see a reformed financial architecture. And this will mean African countries being able to access financing at way cheaper rates, and at the same time, the share of green finance coming to Africa is still very negligible. Right now, Africa has some of the richest resources that are needed for the green transition. We have the deposits of lithium. We have a host of other minerals that I may not mention them right now, but majority of these raw materials are in Africa, and yet the rich countries need these materials when it comes to electric bikes, electric buses. They need these materials that are based here in Africa. And the global conversation right now is how can we have African countries say, wait a minute, why don't we build an EV plant here
in Africa,
for example,
so that we can use these minerals ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that we stop the old practice of shipping out raw materials, then we only receive the end product. The push right now by African leaders is really how can African countries speak with one voice? Because when you look at southern parts of Africa, there are huge deposits of various minerals that are critical for the green transition. The same applies to East Africa and Central Africa. So there has to be a lot of reflections among leaders to develop policies that will be able to cushion and shield African countries from being subjected to further exploitation by the sheer fact that they'll be able to put in place the right systems to usher in the green transition. We are seeing countries already putting up the green legislative environment, and this is one of the countries right now that has really been ahead of others is Rwanda. Rwanda recently received financing from the IMF under the Sustainability Financing Framework, and this is an important aspect because Rwanda, being the first country to go that route, opens up other African countries to borrow examples from Rwanda and say, how do we also structure our ecosystem to be able to accommodate this level of financing? Because the climate adaptation and climate mitigation continues to remain a big challenge for many countries in Africa, and we have this opportune moment to seize the opportunity.
I like the idea of trying to build our own plants or factories, let's say, to consume these minerals so that we avoid exporting raw materials. I'm thinking, in Africa, if we have to build these things, we have to do them ourselves.
Yeah.
If a particular country cannot raise the money or cannot have the budget, for example, to establish a certain plant that maybe uses lithium or consumes another mineral, international cooperation demands that probably these African countries put together, because if this is an expensive thing to achieve, they put together, they chip in some money, and then they have something done. In the event, because this has been going on for a long time, in the event that it is still not possible, we expect that probably foreign countries will come, because it's a global crisis. Foreign countries will come and support us. Now, I'm wondering how a foreign country, how the US, for example, or how those European countries who are actually competing with us for these minerals can help us to establish a plant that will make more distribution of these minerals to them limited, because we shall be consuming more of these. I don't think they could, they will really, that's my own perception. I don't think they will easily support. And even if they did support, I think it could be a bit of double standards, because they can, I don't see them supporting, because they would fear in the event that if they establish it in Africa, then they are going to create their own competition in terms of market. What do you think?
You are absolutely right, Sam. When you look at some of the conversations right now from the African caucus of leaders, they are of the view that, of course, by the fact that African leaders are pushing for the plants to be set up here, it is beneficial to Africa, because we no longer will be just exporting the raw material, we'll be processing it at source, which means there'll be more value addition happening. On the flip side, for the rich countries, this doesn't quite sit well, because it means they will be exporting jobs from their countries, and the jobs will be coming to Africa. So this is a very delicate conversation that many of the companies that are global and looking to pursue the mineral wealth that Africa has, these are some of the hot conversations that would want to see our African leaders sustaining them and putting their foot on the ground and saying, we are not going to export unprocessed raw materials. We saw that in neighboring Uganda, where the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, said they will no longer be exporting unprocessed gold. And this has already seen Uganda witness a huge demand for gold. And the artisanal miners are now benefiting. The locals are getting better money for their wealth. And this is the route African leaders should eventually take. And it comes at a heavy price because some of those big multinationals may not be willing to lose control. Others have been able to structure very good contracts that is balanced, and it's a win-win. So it has to be an ongoing issue and a subject that must be revisited over and over as we progress with this whole issue around turning value chains to support Africa other than exporting value chains to other developed economies.
Well, I hope it works out the soonest.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, Abi, again on global inequality, especially pertaining gender issues. There are so many challenges with women emancipation, with women's rights, observing their rights as women. And there is special emphasis that is supposed to be put to this. But I don't want to still sound skeptical, but this, like I said, it is still a song that has been going on. But I think, well, if I take, for example, the Rwanda as an example, at least there is a certain level of women emancipation that is very clear, be it in levels of leadership, be it in education. Girls go to school as much as boys do. Even at the higher level of governance, there are so many women involved in leadership positions, decision-making positions, you know. But when you look elsewhere, it's not as appealing as it should be. What do you think is that missing link? So, because these UN assemblies just keep talking about this. I'm very sure next year they will come back and talk about the same thing. If you look back and see what has been achieved in 1 year, there is nothing to show for this. What do you think is the missing link?
Well, Sam, to give you just some background, when you look at the gender gap, it has been a very hot issue right now at a global level, at a regional level, even at national level. Women are the most section of the community that have been sort of relegated to not be part of the mainstream. And this is not how things should work. Because when you look at the gender parity gap, it's quite appalling to see that we still are far from achieving the 2/3 gender rule in most African countries. And this has led to so many gaps in our social economic outcomes. When you look at cases in point, as you did rightly put out, Rwanda is one of the countries that has one of the highest number of...
Actually, I think it's the best globally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's one of the countries that is a bright spot, where you see the role women are playing in leadership, in driving the country's economy, and at the same time, the health issues. When you look at the health sector, for example, right now, 70% of workers in the health industry are women. And this cuts across from the nurses to the clinicians to the doctors. But the women that are in leadership in the health sector, for example, is so marginal. We have less than 15% of women in top leadership in the health industry. And yet, women are some of the most effective caregivers. And this has, of course, raised a lot of concern in terms of how can countries bridge the gap. We have seen a number of initiatives from issues around the women empowerment campaign. We've seen the affirmative action, where positions are specifically set aside for women. And this has seen countries make a few steps ahead, but it is still far from being won. And of course, personally, I feel this ought to be a major area of priority, because when we have inequality in this day and age, it is quite an abomination.
Yeah, true. Abi, also they discussed about global security. The UN summit actually pointed out the Gaza, the Ukraine and Russia. They pointed out the Sudan crisis. And they say still collective efforts are required. Everyone has to put a hand into this to have, of course, I understand the effects of this war. In our previous discussions, we have talked about this. It affects literally everything, agriculture, health, everything. Yeah, so at this time in point, how committed do you think UN is actually to get this out of the way?
Well, the UN Secretary General has been on record saying that they have been calling for a ceasefire, especially in the Middle East. And this has, of course, not translated to what majority had hoped, that there would be the silencing of guns. We are still seeing cases of invasions. We are still seeing attacks happening, lives being lost at the expense of people who are in power not being willing to come to a common agreement. So the current state of affairs is quite worrying, because when there are global tensions, this has far-reaching ramifications on many countries. And the UN, on its part, has been, of course, really pushing towards a full ceasefire. And this has been anchored on the Security Council that has been quite vocal, calling on the cessation of hostilities among some of the warring nations. And this cuts across Russia and Ukraine. We've also seen global support coming in different capacities, from support from a military side of things, support from relief side of equation. And this already shows that there has to be some level of willingness for the leaders to come to an agreement and say, we have to stop this. And the current state of affairs, especially with the Sudan crisis, is going to be having a big impact, because South Sudan is going to an election in December. And right now, the current state of affairs may see a delay, perhaps, in the elections. And this has already impacted on the stability of that region. This has reduced the level of foreign direct investment coming in.
Economy actually is very, very much affected. Because
exactly.
Of that.
So there has to be a full cessation of hostilities, but at the same time, some of those leaders are calling for justice. They are saying the UN has to be able to be the midwife to broker a truce between the countries that are currently not at talking terms. And this already shows that there is a lot of concern around resources as well as governance. So all this has to be handled very delicately. And the UN has really put in a lot of effort. And we hope to see more of the security members of the Security Council also walk and put their money where their mouth is.
Well, our time is fast spent, but we cannot just run away without actually relating this security issue to the regional standards, because it also affects us more. Just in the neighborhood, in the DRC, I think it came up as a subject at the UN General Assembly, and most of the speakers were conceptualizing it into like a peace-building process, human rights violations that should actually be reversed, you know, that kind of thing. And especially they said that it should be a responsibility of the international community that is trying to broker the peace between different rebel groups in the eastern DRC. They are our close neighbors, and we have seen a lot. We have been affected directly because whenever someone in Congo sneezes, Rwanda will definitely catch the flu because it's very close. So we have our own share of the experience. But it seems to me that it wasn't given the right attention, the adequate attention, as much as it is required at the UN summit. As we conclude, are my eyes well opened from what they say, or there's something I missed?
Well, this remains to be a very sensitive subject in terms of regional peace and stability. I was present at the inauguration of President Paul Kagame to serve for his new term in office. And I carefully listened to his speech, and he was very straightforward, saying that there has to be willingness from both parties for this situation to be resolved. And he also indicated that it is high time that African countries chart out solutions for their countries. We saw the African leadership at the UN, and you've rightly pointed it out that it did not receive the due attention it deserves, considering that the magnitude of this instability and what it can cause to East Africa. Right now, we do understand that there are still efforts from the Joint Military Force that is currently working towards peace building in the region, and at the same time, we are monitoring the situation. I may not have all the responses to this issue because I haven't interacted deeply with it, but it's something that we'll definitely love to cover in detail in our future show.
All right. Thank you so much, Abby. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your insights. You've actually helped us understand more, deeper conversations that took place at the UN General Assembly.
Thank you, my brother.
I look forward to seeing you again.
Awesome.
And you, our viewer, thanks a lot for keeping tabs on us. As usual, be sure to receive very entertaining, very attractive, and very comprehensive discussions on global issues. The Perspective will be back soon. Thank you so much. God bless you, and God bless Africa.